I froze in the middle of my living room, staring at him as he waved those papers like a trophy. "Sign or get out," he sneered, smirking as if the house I had worked every hour of my life to pay for meant nothing. I had thought owning this home would finally bring me peace, a place where I was untouchable, where no one could undermine me. But in that instant, every proud moment, every sacrifice, every lonely night I spent scrubbing, budgeting, and negotiating flashed before my eyes, and he turned it all into a joke. My hands trembled, my chest tightened, and for a second, I almost believed he had the right to do this. He laughed again, loud and cruel, and my anger began simmering, hot and quiet, like a storm behind my ribs. I wanted to scream, to throw the papers into the fire, but I stayed still, tasting the bitter realization that he thought he could control me. How had it come to this, that the life I built was suddenly something to mock? He didn't see me yet, didn't realize I had always been waiting for this moment. Not to beg, not to break, but to rise. My disbelief hardened into resolve, a slow, steady pulse of determination, and I made a silent vow. He would regret underestimating me. He would learn the hard truth about what it meant to cross me. I took a breath, feeling every ounce of indignation settle into sharp clarity, and I let him see it in my eyes, a warning he hadn't expected. I retreated to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind me, though the echo of his laughter still clung to the walls. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled into this cruel joke. Memories started flooding in, moments I had brushed off as minor slights but now burned with the sting of betrayal. Like the time he rolled his eyes when I insisted on paying for our dinner instead of letting him splurge, as if my independence embarrassed him. Or when he casually dismissed my promotion at work, claiming it was lucky timing, while praising his friends' achievements endlessly. Even family gatherings had carried their subtle judgments, whispered comparisons that I had laughed off to keep the peace. Each instance had built quietly, layer upon layer, until it had become a weight too heavy to ignore. The realization settled uncomfortably. The house, the money, the effort. None of it had shielded me from his contempt. My hands clenched, nails biting into my palms. As shock morphed into a slow burning anger, I felt a mix of grief for all those moments I let slide, and a fierce determination to reclaim my dignity. In the quiet of that room, I began piecing together a plan, not out of haste, but with the clarity of someone who had finally seen the full picture. I needed someone to witness what had just happened, someone who could validate the outrage I felt bubbling inside me. I called my closest friend first, my voice tight as I recounted every humiliating word, every mocking gesture. She gasped audibly, her sympathy immediate, and without hesitation, she told me I should confront him, make him see that he couldn't treat me like a fool in my own home. Later, I spoke with my sister, expecting support, but her reaction was measured, almost cautious. She reminded me to stay calm, to think strategically, and to avoid burning bridges too quickly. Even my parents weighed in, torn between shock at his audacity and a subtle warning that appearances mattered. Their words stirred an uncomfortable tension, status, pride, and fear intertwined with my anger. The more I shared, the clearer it became that everyone around me viewed this from their own lens. Some craving the drama, some urging patience, all subtly reminding me of my position in the social hierarchy. I realized that navigating their advice would be almost as challenging as facing him. And yet, beneath the mixed reactions, a spark of determination grew. If I played my cards right, I could turn both his arrogance and their doubts to my advantage. Sitting alone that evening, the initial shock finally gave way to clarity. I had spent years quietly building my life, earning my own money, and securing this house entirely in my name. For the first time, I truly saw the leverage I had always underestimated: legal ownership, financial independence, and a small but loyal circle of friends who believed in me. Suddenly, the mockery and condescension he had thrown at me didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an opportunity. I began running scenarios through my mind, considering every way I could assert control without stooping to his level of cruelty. Letters, legal notices, subtle social maneuvers. Each option carried its own weight, but together, they formed a web of possibilities. I could feel the tension of anticipation, a pulse of energy that made my fingers tap against the table as I formulated a plan. The anger that had simmered now transformed into focused determination, and I allowed myself a small, grim smile. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to his insults. I was strategizing, calculating, and preparing to reclaim the respect and power he thought he could mock. The next morning, I began with subtle moves, almost imperceptible but deliberate. I canceled a few privileges he had grown accustomed to: his favorite coffee subscription, the weekend car service, small things that signaled I was no longer taking his arrogance lightly. When he tried to brush it off with a casual remark, I responded with quiet wit, letting him see I was aware of his games and would no longer play along. At dinner, I inserted pointed comments about boundaries and fairness, phrasing them as casual observations, but each word landed with weight. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, enough to make me notice, enough to give me a thrill of control. Friends who visited began to pick up on the shift, subtly acknowledging my rising confidence without directly challenging him. Even our neighbors seemed to sense the change, throwing curious glances as I carried myself with a calm authority he hadn't seen before. Each minor assertion of power was like a brick placed carefully in the foundation of a much larger plan. With every exchange, every cleverly placed boundary, I felt the scales begin to tilt, and a quiet satisfaction settled over me. He thought he was untouchable, but I was proving in small but undeniable ways that I was far from powerless. The following weekend, we attended a dinner party he had insisted on hosting, the kind filled with wealthy acquaintances who adored his bravado and dismissed my presence as background noise. As he laughed loudly, telling exaggerated stories of his supposed successes, I observed quietly, letting the irritation build into a calm, deliberate plan. I engaged guests with charm and subtle wit, recounting anecdotes that highlighted my own accomplishments without ever seeming boastful, planting seeds of doubt in their perception of him. When he attempted to interrupt, I responded with measured, intelligent humor that made him falter mid-sentence, a moment so brief but so telling that several heads subtly turned in my direction. Later, as the conversation shifted to luxury travel and investments, I casually mentioned a recent acquisition he hadn't been aware of, letting the implication linger. I was far more capable than he had ever imagined. The discomfort on his face was fleeting but real, a crack in the armor of his arrogance. By the end of the evening, whispers of admiration circled discreetly, and I could sense the first ripple of envy and FOMO stirring in him. I returned home that night with a quiet, victorious smile. He had underestimated me, and the first major reversal had been set in motion. Later that night, I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the laughter and chatter from earlier still echoing faintly in my mind. For the first time, the adrenaline faded, leaving a hollow ache of doubt and loneliness. I questioned whether this path I had chosen, meticulously plotting, slowly undermining him, was worth the cost to my own peace. Memories of the early years, when love had seemed real and unshakable, clung to me with bittersweet force, and I wondered if my anger had overshadowed the hope I once held. Was I becoming someone I wouldn't recognize, consumed by revenge instead of simply living? Tears pricked the corners of my eyes as I admitted to myself the truth. The humiliation he had inflicted had left a mark deeper than I cared to show anyone. And yet, beneath the pain, there was a persistent pulse of clarity. I wasn't powerless, and this wasn't mindless retaliation. It was reclaiming what was rightfully mine. The quiet hours gave me perspective. The stakes were high, the moral lines blurred, but the fire in my chest remained steady, a reminder that I could endure and emerge stronger, wiser, and vindicated. I laid everything out on the kitchen table like a general mapping a campaign. The papers I had saved over the years, mortgage statements, closed bank accounts, ATM receipts, the odd email where he'd boasted about me not understanding finances, were spread in a tidy, ordinary mess that felt anything but. For hours I let the details speak to me, each number and signed line a reminder of how much quiet labor had built the life he was now trying to take for granted. I knew this couldn't be one of those spur-of-the-moment retaliations. If I wanted to win, I needed structure and patience. First, I thought about the law. Ownership on paper was one thing, but reality in court could be messy if he chose to make it messy. I made a list of lawyers, reached out to an old colleague who owed me a favor, and scheduled a consultation that would make a statement. I was not afraid to litigate. That move alone was enough to change the tone of our private battles. Now there was potential public exposure, and he hated the idea of private matters becoming gossip among people he wanted to impress. Next, I mapped out the social route. People's opinions mattered in the circles we navigated. The right whisper in the right ear could turn allies into spectators. I thought through who I could trust, who would believe me without needing convincing, and who might be manipulated into stepping away. My friend who hosted charity galas could subtly shift seating arrangements. The neighbor who spoke at homeowners association meetings could be primed to mention my name in passing. Little social nudges could compound into a reputation shift that would isolate him in precisely the places he relied on for applause. Financial leverage felt like the coldest, most strategic piece. If negotiations ever reached a transactional point, having airtight records of payments and investments would force terms in my favor. I reviewed insurance policies, mortgage clauses, and even the small joint accounts he'd assumed were unimportant. I pulled statements for the renovation bills I'd quietly paid myself, the contractors who'd confirm my payments, every mundane proof that could become a compelling narrative in the right light. Numbers don't lie, and in a room full of well-dressed denials, receipts have a way of sounding like truth. I also considered timing, how to land each move so it felt inevitable rather than vindictive. I would start with a legal nudge, a letter that would quietly signal my seriousness. Then, once the threat of public scrutiny loomed, I'd let the social fabric fray in carefully measured ways. If he pushed back, the financial trail would be the lever to tighten the screws. My plan was not about spectacle. It was about margin for error, about sequencing actions so that he had nowhere comfortable to run, and every refusal he made only dug the hole deeper. There were risks, of course. I thought about humility and hubris, about who I might hurt besides him, but every compromise he'd forced on me in the past felt like a cost I had already paid. This was simply reclaiming. As the night grew late, I annotated the stack of papers with little notes, contact names, dates, the first legal email draft I might send. Each note made the plan feel more real, more inevitable. Finally, I sat back and let the strategy settle in my bones. I imagined the first move, a crisp, formal letter arriving at his office, the kind that turned private arrogance into public record. I could almost see his face when he read it. I smiled, not from cruelty, but from the satisfaction of someone who had found leverage where others had seen none. Then, as if hearing a prelude to a larger symphony, I wrote the first line of that letter in my head, a quiet announcement that my patience had limits, and the next move would be perfect. I folded the papers neatly, knowing once they left my hands the truth would begin its slow, unforgiving work soon. I called my closest confidant first, the one friend who had always seen me clearly, who never dismissed my frustrations or minimized my accomplishments. Over coffee, I laid out the situation, careful to phrase my words with both precision and subtle humor, the way I knew she would appreciate. She listened, nodding at just the right moments, eyes narrowing thoughtfully when I mentioned the legal leverage I had amassed. "You've been underestimated for too long," she said softly, leaning forward. "It's time they see the truth." Her words were both validation and encouragement, a reminder that I wasn't alone, that there were people willing to navigate this chessboard with me. Next, I reached out to the lawyer I had quietly contacted earlier. Over the phone, I detailed the nuances: ownership, past payments, his dismissive behavior, and potential social ramifications. She asked precise, cutting questions, probing for weaknesses in my story, ensuring that when the time came, there would be no opening for him to wriggle free. With every suggestion, every strategic adjustment, I felt the plan crystallize into something tangible, something dangerous for him yet perfectly within my control. Even a distant relative, one I had barely trusted before, proved instrumental, offering knowledge of his social calendar and unguarded habits. Their input allowed me to schedule the first moves with impeccable timing. I listened, processed, and incorporated each detail, my mind working like a finely tuned engine. Scenes of social gatherings, dinner parties, and casual conversations began to rearrange themselves in my imagination, each one a potential battlefield, each word I might speak a calculated strike. By the end of the night, the plan was no longer theoretical. Allies were briefed, contingencies considered, and every small piece of information aligned like stars, forming a constellation visible only to me. I felt a thrill of anticipation as I realized the first move was ready to unfold. One careful email, one subtle maneuver, and the game would begin. I closed my laptop with a steady hand, heart racing, knowing that in the morning, everything would change, and there was no turning back. It happened at a charity gala he insisted we attend. A glittering room filled with people who usually hung on his every boastful word. He was in his element, telling exaggerated stories about his investments, laughing at jokes he thought only he could make funny. I watched silently, noting every smirk, every subtle superiority he displayed toward me in front of others. Then, as if handing me the key to the next move, he made it. A gloating comment about my lack of involvement in the local business community, phrased so casually yet loaded with derision. The room chuckled politely, but I could see the flicker of doubt in their eyes as they glanced at me. I seized the moment without hesitation. Leaning forward, I responded lightly, almost conversationally, recounting a recent project I had spearheaded that had brought more revenue and recognition than he could boast of in a year. I described it with modest humor, letting my confidence and precision speak louder than words. The effect was immediate. Heads turned, whispers began, and the air shifted. The social balance tilted subtly but unmistakably, and for the first time that evening, he looked unsure, caught off guard. My pulse raced, but I stayed calm, projecting ease. I could see the admiration and quiet envy in the eyes of his usual audience, the exact FOMO I had anticipated. Every anecdote I wove was calculated to highlight competence over arrogance, control over chaos. As he tried to regain footing with a forced laugh, I pressed gently, inserting another subtle fact that revealed his exaggeration without seeming aggressive. His smirk faltered, his words stumbled, and a silent, delicious satisfaction settled over me. By the end of the evening, the first seeds of social humiliation had taken root. I had not shouted, accused, or made a scene. I had simply shown, in the most understated way possible, that the narrative he thought he controlled was slipping. And I knew with a thrill I couldn't suppress that the second major power reversal had begun, one that would continue to unravel him quietly but completely. Just when I thought the momentum was entirely in my favor, a shock hit me. My cousin, someone I had always trusted implicitly, sided openly with him, offering support in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, disbelief froze me. How could someone so close act against me at this crucial moment? I felt the sting of betrayal cut sharper than anything he had done, and for a heartbeat, the carefully constructed plan seemed precarious. But then clarity returned. This was exactly the kind of challenge I had anticipated. Nothing ever goes perfectly in these battles. I took a step back, observing their interactions, listening to their words, and noting their assumptions. Each slip of overconfidence, each revealing glance, became a piece of intelligence I could use. I adapted quickly, recalibrating my strategy to account for this new factor, finding alternative allies and subtle ways to redirect attention and influence. By the end of the confrontation, I had turned the complication into a minor obstacle, a test of my resourcefulness rather than a setback. My pulse steadied, and a quiet thrill ran through me. I was resilient, capable, and ready to press forward. The night of the gala felt charged, electric with the weight of anticipation I had built over weeks of careful planning. I entered quietly, letting my presence be noticed without announcing it, aware that every eye would soon measure my composure against his arrogance. He approached with a smug grin, unaware that the room's energy was subtly shifting in my favor. The first comment he made was a jibe about my supposed irrelevance in the business project I had led, a line he had rehearsed to provoke laughter. I smiled, calm and measured, and in one breath recounted the facts. Numbers, emails, contracts, all evidence of my leadership, all delivered conversationally yet pointedly. The whispers started immediately, hushed recognition rippling through the crowd. He tried to recover, laughing nervously, but each attempt only highlighted his ignorance of the full picture. I leaned into the social leverage I had meticulously constructed, referencing mutual friends and past events in a way that made his misjudgments undeniable. By the time I spoke of the upcoming legal filings regarding the property, eyes widened, and the murmurs became quiet awe. Every carefully orchestrated ally, every subtle piece of evidence I had set in motion, converged in that moment. The room's attention was firmly on him, and his face flushed with the realization that the joke had turned. As he stammered for an explanation, the social and legal traps I had laid bore fruit. His friends, who had once chuckled at my perceived naivety, now shifted uneasily, some whispering their acknowledgement of the truth. The contrast between his earlier dominance and his present flustered state was undeniable. He was stripped of the control he had wielded so easily. I remained poised, confident, and dignified, knowing that humiliation was not just personal revenge, but public vindication. When the final revelation landed, a subtle mention of his overconfidence in dismissing the legal documents I had prepared, the atmosphere shifted completely. The energy in the room was electric, a tangible sigh of justice as those around us realized the tables had irrevocably turned. In that climactic moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of catharsis, a satisfaction that no words could fully capture. Years of being underestimated, mocked and dismissed, culminated in a scene that left him exposed, while I stood quietly triumphant, reclaiming both respect and dignity. Later, alone in the quiet of my home, I sank into the familiar comfort of my own space, the house that had been both a symbol of independence and a battleground finally feeling like mine again. The adrenaline of the public confrontation had faded, leaving a warm, steady sense of empowerment in its place. I thought about the weeks of planning, the careful orchestration of allies, and the patience I had maintained even when doubt gnawed at me. Justice had been served, not through spectacle alone, but through strategic action and unwavering resolve. There was a bittersweet twinge as I reflected on the personal costs, the sleepless nights, the tension with family, and the reminder that trust could falter even in the closest relationships. Yet, the satisfaction of reclaiming dignity, of demonstrating that power and patience outweigh arrogance and mockery, outweighed the lingering sorrow. I felt stronger, more confident, and quietly proud of the resilience I had discovered within myself. In the end, the lessons were clear. Patience, strategy, and self-belief can turn humiliation into triumph, and even in betrayal, one can find clarity and strength. Weeks later, as I moved through my days with quiet confidence, I noticed the subtle shifts around me. Conversations that once ignored my presence now paused in recognition, and people who had doubted me seemed hesitant to assume they understood the story. I smiled privately at the thought that the very arrogance that had once mocked me was now tempered by an unspoken caution. In casual mentions among mutual friends, I let hints of new ventures and opportunities slip, careful not to boast but enough to spark curiosity and, yes, a little envy. The house, the accomplishments, and the carefully orchestrated victories were mine. But the true triumph was knowing that my independence could never again be questioned. There was still tension lingering in some relationships, unspoken and electric, a reminder that power is maintained by awareness and subtlety, not force alone. I carried that quiet strength forward, aware that the story wasn't just a single confrontation. It was a new way of living. And somewhere I knew, those who had underestimated me would watch closely, wondering what came next.